All right, so the second session, which focuses on chapters 3 and 4, is entitled What We Owe to Each Other, Redemption and Restoration in Ruth. And you'll see that I've put up there 2 pictures from The Good Place. Hands up if you've watched The Good Place. Good, well you did better than the Northeast group because lots of them hadn't watched it. I don't think anyone had watched it in that setting. Okay, so without giving away any spoilers, The Good Place begins with somebody who's waking up and discovers that they've died and they've gone to the good place. And in the course of the programme, they meet other people who've also died and gone to the good place, one of whom is an ethics professor who, for various reasons, seeks to help the different people become better, learn how to be good in some way. And a key text that they use or a kind of key reference that they use is this idea of what we owe to each other. So I've got a little quote here from Chidi Anagonye, who's the professor of ethics in the story. And he says, "So why do it then? Why choose to be good every day if there is no guaranteed reward we can count on now or in the afterlife? I argue that we choose to be good because of our bonds with other people and our innate desire to treat them with dignity. Simply put, we are not in this alone." So that seemed to me a very fitting connection with the Book of Ruth and these final 2 chapters, because a lot of what Ruth explores is what each of us owe each other. What do Ruth, Naomi and Boaz in this part of the book owe to each other? And how does the Book of Ruth help us to pay attention to our own commitments, what we owe to each other? And as I've already indicated, it's not that Ruth is saying, this is the law, this is what we owe to each other and we have to follow it to the letter. Ruth is kind of saying, actually, the law is a conversation we have. We have a conversation with the law, and there's space and ambiguity for us to be able to go beyond what we owe. So a lot of Ruth is about people who go beyond what they actually owe by the letter of the law and offer more generously something of themselves and their resources. So keep that in mind while we're working through these chapters, and we'll move on to chapter 3, which I've entitled The Book of Ruth. And before we hear the first part of chapter 3, I wanted to draw your attention to another particular way of reading the Book of Ruth, which is Ruth as Carnival. I've already mentioned this, and I'm particularly drawing here on the work of Nahama Aski, who's a scholar who wrote an article on this in 2007. So she talks about how carnival and carnivalesque readings of the Book of Ruth make visible the kind of uncontrollable, chaotic nature of the book and different aspects of it. It helps us to pay attention to things like mockery and irony throughout the book of Ruth. So we see that even at the beginning when Elimelech is called Elimelech, my God is king, and yet there are no, there is kind of a time of the judges, and quickly Elimelech realises he's kind of out of place. She suggests that Ruth is a comic folk tale about the survival of the poor, in this case Ruth and Naomi, contrasted with or set against some quite ponderous debates about legal codes, which particularly Boaz seems to enjoy. So Boaz's conversation is written in a style of Hebrew that is very stilted, archaic, and kind of, he rambles on. If you actually just look at how long Boaz talks, he talks for ages, and it's all very kind of flowery language, whereas Ruth is very sharp and to the point. And that's, again, fitting with this idea that Boaz is almost being set up as a figure of fun. Boaz's name is a reference to the pillar of the temple, so the pillar of the community, who's knows the law inside out and is upstanding and good, and yet somehow he's been gently mocked through the story. She also notes how within many kind of carnivalesque comic tales, there's a focus on the basic realities of human life, drinking, eating, sleeping and having sex, and how these are things that kind of level all humans. Whether you're rich or poor, you still need to eat, for example. And so again, we see that some of that levelling within this chapter, where Boaz is asleep on the threshing floor with his workers and the other men. And she points out how often these carnival moments or tales or stories or moments in the calendar are about chaos. So we might think about people dressing up, people being the boy bishops, all that kind of tradition where the order of things is upturned, and there's a momentary gap in the established order where anything can happen, and boundaries can be crossed and new suggestions and possibilities emerge. So again, something for you to kind of consider and hold in your head. Can you read the Book of Ruth as a story that has something of the carnival, of the fair, of the wildness about it? And how does that help you see what's going on? So let's hear, if we can, from Ruth chapter 3, verses 1 to 5. And Sue's going to come and read us. Thank you, Sue.
Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, I need to seek some security for you, so that it may be well with you. Now here is our kinsman Boaz, with whose young women you have been working. See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Now wash and anoint yourself, and put on your best clothes, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." She said to her, "All that you tell me, I will do."
Thank you. So a question for this section would be, what might the Book of Ruth help us to speak of? Naomi says, "My daughter, I need to seek some rest for you." That's the kind of a different translation of the Hebrew. Rest, refuge, a space where you can be protected. And not only you, but me, because I'm relying on your work, your labour, to get what I need as well. But what is the cost? If we read this passage in any other book but the Bible, we would know what the cost is. But somehow, because it's in the Bible, we hide away from the reality of what the text is saying. Here, the stories of Ruth and Esther are intertwined. And even very similar words and patterns of words are used in both sections. Both young women who are far from home and under the control of others are told to bathe, anoint and adorn themselves in order to have sex with an older, more powerful man. That is the reality. And if we shy away from that, we are doing the characters and other women and men and vulnerable people who are put in similar vulnerable positions in our own societies a disservice. We need to see what's happening in the text. Now, this doesn't mean that Ruth is, in this instance, necessarily some kind of passive victim. She knows what she's doing, and to some extent we could talk about how much she and Naomi plan this together. So is Naomi exploiting Ruth, or are Ruth and Naomi exploiting Boaz, or is everybody kind of in it to try and figure out what they need to get by? So again, think about this story as a story of survival, and it might help us to see how each of the characters recognises what they need to do to survive. Interestingly, often this text and kind of Ruth is missed off the lectionary and not preached on. And again, if this week has taught us anything, it has taught us that we need to be able to talk about sex in church in positive, helpful and honest ways, because otherwise it's there and it leads to problematic relationships and problematic abuses of power. Well, let's go on and see what happens next in the story. So if we can have verses 6 to 13 read now, please, Sue.
So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had instructed her. When Boaz had eaten and drunk, and he was in a contented mood, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came quietly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight the man was startled and turned over, and there, lying at his feet, was a woman. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over your servant, for you are a next of kin." He said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. This last instance of your loyalty is better than the first. You have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not be afraid. I will do for you all that you ask, for all the assembly of my people know that you are a worthy woman. But now, though it is true that I am a near kinsman, there is another kinsman more closely related than I. Remain this night, and in the morning, if he will act as next of kin for you, good, let him do so. If he is not willing to act as next of kin for you, then as the Lord lives, I will act as next of kin for you. Lie down until the morning."
Thank you. We have this beautiful image from Mark Chagall here, Ruth and Boaz there under the moonlight. And I was reading some resources yesterday that talked about how the breasts of Ruth are reflected in the moonlight, and there's a kind of connection there. Both are kind of shining out in some way of the picture. But I wonder also, this is something that I think is very visible within the text, but perhaps we don't always see. I'll read to you the bit again. It says, when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and he was in a contented mood, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. And my question is Ruth reaching for Boaz or the heap of grain? So is she reaching for Boaz's heap, shall we say, or is she reaching for the heap of grain? And I kind of like the idea that Ruth is in the dark trying to get to the grain, and then she ends up grasping hold of Boaz and thinks, oh, well, I'll have to go ahead with that then. But I was hoping to go straight for the grain. So there's something there again about a reminder that the story is primarily about survival and food and bread. And this is Ruth. What stands between Ruth and the grain is Boaz. So she has to kind of deal with Boaz. Questions again about who is vulnerable. So we could very well read this story as Ruth being vulnerable. She's a young woman, she's alone, she's been sent to sleep with Boaz. If we believe that sex takes place, which I feel it does, but the text is silent about it, so there's space for different possible readings. But it could also be that Boaz is vulnerable here too. He's older, confused, in the dark, doesn't know what's going on. Is he to some extent taken advantage of by Ruth and Naomi? There are positives and negatives, or helpful and unhelpful things with both these readings. So again, I would say think about which one you find most comfortable and ask yourself why the other reading makes you uncomfortable, because perhaps that's something that you can learn from. This passage also links us to lots of other stories. So it links us to the story in Genesis 38 about Judah and Tamar, and when Judah sleeps with Tamar, who is his daughter-in-law, mistaking her for a woman, a sex worker. And there's kind of confusion there, confusion about clothing and inappropriate sexual relationships that happen under the cover of confusion. It also links to the story of David and Bathsheba. And some scholars think that Ruth is written as a way of kind of thinking, oh, David really messed up with Bathsheba. We need a kind of another story that's a little bit more wholesome, where Boaz and Ruth don't sleep together, but are still part of the story of David to kind of counterbalance the David-Bathsheba story. Yes?
Can we just ask, does Moab, have we told anywhere else whether Moab has another family already? About Boaz rather, whether he has a wife or children, or whether for him this is the son that he might not have had otherwise?
Well, we're not told that, so the rabbis, as ever, have some delightful conversations, and some say that Boaz has a wife and she dies the day that Ruth arrives with Naomi. So there's a kind of conclusion of that life, and then the space opening up. Another reading, which again some of you may value and others might find difficult, is, we think about this again. Boaz is an older character, he hasn't ever married. If he hasn't ever married, why is that? Now, on the one hand, it's because he is wealthy and he's able to not marry. But it also could reveal something about him as we might call a queer character. So a character that identifies as gay or as another sexual identity. And perhaps Boaz doesn't want to marry. And that's why he hasn't married. And then we can think about how Boaz, Ruth and Naomi form their own community to have a child, which they all need, but they don't necessarily want in the same conventional style as had been expected. So lots of possibilities with Boaz too. Okay, so here again, Boaz enacts the blessing that he asks for Ruth. So just as before he says, I hope that God provides for you, and then he starts giving Ruth grain. Here, elsewhere he talks about, I hope that God protects you, spreads God's wings over you. And then Ruth is like, spread your wings over me. And the wings are it's a kind of bit of a muddled word. So it can mean the blanket, the mantle, but it can also sometimes be a kind of reference to sexual genitalia. So it can kind of work in different ways. But there's again the idea that Boaz is the one who's enacting the blessing that he seeks for Ruth in some way, which again is an encouraging way of reading Boaz's actions, that he's seeking to do well by Ruth. Okay, final, not quite, but nearly. So, yes, if we could have from verses 14 to 18, please. So the last bit of chapter 3.
So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before one person could recognize another. For he said, "It must not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor." Then he said, "Bring the cloak you are wearing and hold it out." So she held it out, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her back. Then he went into the city. She came to her mother-in-law, who said, "How did things go with you, my daughter?" Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, "He gave me these 6 measures of barley, for he said, 'Do not go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" She replied, "Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today."
Thank you. So this image from Rembrandt, who drew 3 images of Ruth, 3 scenes from Ruth, is Boaz pouring out the grain into Ruth's mantle. So again, the mantle wings imagery is very clear. The mantle or the blanket, the shawl, forms a connection between Boaz and Ruth, so they're linked. Again, it's a kind of sign of their forthcoming linking through marriage. And if you imagine Ruth, she picks up this big mound of grain, and before she puts it on her back, it's on her stomach, because she's, it's again representing her coming pregnancy, her coming fullness in another way. Perhaps, but don't we all? So, in the Hebrew, which we miss in the translation, the question that Naomi actually asks Ruth is not how did things go with you, but who are you? And this is the third time that question is asked about Ruth. In the first time, Boaz asks his servant, to whom does this young woman belong? So where's she from? Who is she? How does she fit in? And the servant says, she's a foreigner from foreign places. She's a Moabite from Moab. Secondly, Boaz asks Ruth, who are you? Under cover overnight. Who are you, being so bold as to come up to me, this pillar of community? Or who are you? Are you a friend or a foe? Are you a foe? Who goes there, friend or foe, in the cover of night? And thirdly, Naomi asks Ruth, who are you? This seems a bit odd, doesn't it? Because surely she knows by then. But perhaps she's asking, who are you now, the night having passed? This isn't a question about Ruth's virginity, as Ruth has already been married, but it's a question perhaps about her loyalty. Who are you? Are you now betrothed to Boaz? And what does that mean for our relationship? Will you still cling to me? Will you still look after me, even if you are now secure in your relationship with Boaz? All right, we're getting on to chapter 4, and then we'll have a little bit of space for questions and comments once we are completed. So we're going to hear from the Book of Naomi, chapter 4, verses 1 to 8. Thank you.
No sooner had Boaz gone up to the gate and sat down there than the next of kin of who Boaz had spoken about came passing by. So Boaz said, "Come over here, friend, and sit down here." And he went over and sat down. Then Boaz took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." And so they sat down. He then said to the next of kin, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our kinsman Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you'll not, tell me, so that I may know, for there is no one prior to you to redeem it, and I come after you." So he said, "I will redeem it." And then Boaz said, "The day you acquire the field from the hand of Naomi, you are also acquiring Ruth, the Moabite, the widow of the dead man, to maintain the dead man's name on his inheritance." At this, the next of kin said, "I cannot redeem it for myself without damaging my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it." Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging to confirm a transaction. One party took off a sandal and gave it to the other. This was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the next of kin said to Boaz, "Acquire it for yourself," he took off his sandal.
So we have a picture here, one of two, from Channa Helen Rosenberg, and this is her kind of very vivid imagining of the sandal ceremony, where the elders are gathered around the city gate. Again, the city gate is a kind of reference back to, or a kind of intertextual reference to Proverbs 31, with a woman who praises her husband, I think it is, at the city gate, who certainly is a visible woman at the city gate. Quite a few things to kind of unpack in this, things that are a little bit puzzling. So one might be, if Naomi's got this land, why on earth is, all this kerfuffle? Why don't they just use the land for themselves? And I haven't quite come across a kind of helpful explanation that I find helpful yet, but I think the main reason seems to be, that's suggested, is that they may have had the land, but it hadn't been worked, so it wouldn't have been producing grain, or they had the land but they didn't have sufficient resources to work the land. So either way, they had the land but they weren't able to kind of make the most of it. They needed extra investment, so to speak, or extra support to help make it work. But it seems odd that this is kind of only revealed gradually as the story unfolds. There's a lot of discussion and debate about how Boaz and the next of kin, who's called so and so, that's what he's called because his name, he's concerned to protect his own name, but the irony is that he's never given a name. He's called so and so. So he's kind of, again, a character that's dismissed very quickly. So Boaz and the next of kin have this kind of very protracted discussion about who is responsible for the land and who's responsible, therefore, for Ruth. And it's all a bit of a muddle, really. It doesn't actually reflect what the laws say. So it's not that. Boaz really claims wrongly that to take on the land is also to take on Ruth. That's not the case. So there's a little bit of confusion. Now, one reading would be that Boaz is old and a bit confused and gets in a muddle. But it could be that Ruth's encounter with Boaz has given him the gift of trickery, that she's given him a way to get around the fact that he shouldn't marry her because she is a Moabite. Okay? So she's a Moabite, he shouldn't marry her. But he wants to marry her for whatever reason, and she needs to marry him. So they kind of construct this whole scenario where the elders are there, it's very public, somebody's tricked into saying yes and then no in order for them to arrive at the conclusion they want to, which is Boaz gaining the land and marrying Ruth. Okay, so a little bit of kind of trickery going on there in different ways. What else? Perhaps a question for us to take forward into our own context today is who is invited to sit down and make the decision? So on the surface of it, it's the men of the city, the elders. And that is true, but we know that Ruth and Naomi have been behind the scenes manipulating or working things in some way or another to arrive at the conclusion they need to be. But again, helpful for us to think, why do they need to manipulate? Because they haven't got any direct power. They're having to go around the houses. So what needs to change in that situation so everybody has equal access to power and decision making? Right, now, coming on to my favourite bits, the various lists of names and blessings. So if we have Ruth 4 verses 9 to 12, please, Steve.
Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "Today you are witnesses that I have acquired from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, the wife of Mahlon, to be my wife, to maintain the dead man's name on his inheritance, in order that the name of the dead might not be cut off from his kindred and from the gate of his native place. Today you are witnesses." Then all the people who were at the gate, along with the elders, said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you produce children in Ephrathah and bestow a name in Bethlehem. And through the children that the Lord will give you by this young woman, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah."
So this is the first of a final pair of blessings that is given to Ruth, at this time by the people and the elders. Although Ruth is actually not named, it's the woman who is coming into your house and this young woman. It's actually a very odd blessing, but it serves us well to kind of think about some of the connections to Matthew's genealogy, where we meet Ruth again in the New Testament. So in Matthew's genealogy, we have Rahab, Ruth, Tamar, and the wife of Uriah, who's called that within the text, not Bathsheba. where do we have all those people present here? Not quite, but some allusions. So we've already thought about how the story of Ruth may be read in relationship to the story of Bathsheba and some of those kind of interactions and confusions, etc. We've also seen the same links with Tamar, and then Tamar specifically mentioned here. What about Rahab? Well, Rahab doesn't appear directly, but she's invoked a couple of times. And here she's invoked perhaps, I would say, because of her position in the city walls. And this takes place in the gates. So there's some echoing of where Rahab is found in the story in the book of Joshua. What about the people who are named directly within this passage? Well, Rachel and Leah, they're not exactly the kind of people you want a blessing about in terms of their relationship. It's fraught, it's fractured. There's moments when they work together, but there's also moments when there is great tension. And similarly, Perez and his twin, Zerah, who's not mentioned, are also signs of strife. So we've got mention of two siblings or sister wives that are full of strife. Moreover, Perez's name means breach. So is this a blessing or is this a curse? Is the blessing genuinely saying, we salute you because you've managed, like all these other trickster figures, to get what you need to survive? Or is there something more mocking going on that, Ruth and Naomi are told, yes, you're going to be like all these people who fell out and, argued in the past. Again, it's up to us to decide how we want to read that. But certainly we can't help but notice the connections to Matthew's genealogy of Jesus. That, again, a one way of reading is a way of justifying Mary's own difficult, tricky situation in terms of being pregnant outside of marriage, because the four women that are mentioned within the genealogy before we get to Mary are all women that have been put in difficult situations in relation to their sexuality, or their sexual kind of activity. All right then, let's have the final part of Ruth, so from verses 13 to 22, please.
So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When they came together, the Lord made her conceive, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without next of kin, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him." And then Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom and became his nurse. The women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the descendants of Perez. Perez became the father of Hezron, Hezron of Ram, Ram of Aminadab, Aminadab of Nahshon, Nahshon of Salmon, Salmon of Boaz, Boaz of Obed, Obed of Jesse, and Jesse of David.
Thank you. So we have a moment where the child is born, Obed. And who is the child named for? Not his dead father, but Naomi. So even though Boaz says, "I'm taking this woman so that I can raise up children for Mahlon," actually it's Naomi who's named in relation to the child. And then we go on to have this genealogy about Perez. So once again, another mention of Perez, the breacher, is ending this book. What does it mean that Ruth the Moabite becomes part of Judah? So why should we pay attention to this story? Is this story about someone who is different being overwhelmed, gathered into the dominant culture? Or is it about the fact that any culture, any society needs the gift that the stranger, the other, the foreign brings? I would want us to kind of be encouraged by that reading, and particularly at this time, that Ruth is a sign that every community needs otherness, needs difference, and that is where we will find righteousness, faithfulness, love and care. I've got just 3 slides to end with about God, and you might be thinking, well, thank goodness, because we haven't mentioned God very much so far. And there's a good reason for that, because there isn't much mention of God in Ruth, but there are some allusions and invocations of God. So we'll just maybe have a think and maybe put down a word, and then we'll see how that compares. Who is God in Ruth? You might want to put down a word about what God does, or what kind of God is portrayed in Ruth. Okay, you've all got one down? Okay, so see if they are any of these. So God is a God who both gives and takes. God gives bread, God gives babies. God takes bread, God takes the possibilities of babies. God is a God who is invoked for blessings and for curses. God is very much a God who is understood to protect and provide. And God is a God who is chosen. God is not the only God who is worshipped in the Book of Ruth, but God chooses the people of Judah, and God is chosen by a number of people, including Ruth the Moabite. Where is God in Ruth? Well, God is only directly present twice, at the beginning and the end, providing bread and babies, but is invoked and talked about a lot more. However, what is obvious is that much of the work of redemption has to happen through the work of humans. The human characters are the ones that get on and do things, even if they understand that they are living out God's desires, they are acting out God's desires for us. So a couple of images there. God as the wings of protection. We find that image very strongly within Ruth, and then Boaz enacts that. God is the one who provides bread, God, bread love. Again, that's something that is central to the story of Ruth. And a word that we haven't talked about very much, but is very central also to Ruth, is hesed, steadfast love or loving kindness. And one of the ways of reading Ruth is as a story about what loving kindness might look like. How do we live out our belief that God is a God of steadfast love? Well, let's have a look at the Book of Ruth and see what it offers us. The final slide, and this is just 4 words beginning with R to conclude our time with Ruth. This is in your Bible study magazines. But I would suggest that we can read Ruth alongside these 4 words in terms of thinking about what Ruth might offer for us today. Ruth might be a story that offers hope of repair when things are broken or breached. Ruth might be read as a story that demonstrates our resilience, particularly against injustice and suffering and loss. Ruth might be an example of resistance to injustice and violence. And all of those, repair, resilience and resistance, come together in reading Ruth as a story of redemption, of God's desire to redeem us, and how we might work with God to enable that redemption to happen for ourselves, for those we love, and for those who are strangers yet to us. Okay, good. So maybe 3 minutes. I can't believe I finished with 3 minutes to spare. So I think we've got time for questions. Do you want maybe just a minute to chat with your neighbour, and then we'll hear a couple of questions? Does that sound okay? Yes, I'm looking to see if anyone else has a better idea, but yes, that feels okay. Right, let's go for that then. Okay, the minute's up. So, questions. Obed, I think it means servant or service, something like that. So, and again, that could be read as Obed serving God and or Obed serving Naomi. I think that's right, but you can check in a good commentary. All right, other questions?
Can you please explain something that I lost this morning? When we were looking at chapter 1, verses 15 to 18, when we were talking about this contract of survival, and where, if I got this the right way around, Ruth was saying to Naomi, in effect, you saved me, I'll come and work with you. And then you talked about human trafficking, and I got completely lost as to where that came in. Sorry.
Well, what I was saying was one more recent reading that I've come across is to say, is thinking about why is it that Ruth, so the question is, why does Ruth accompany Naomi? So there could be lots of reasons for this. She likes Naomi, she's in love with Naomi, she's committed to Naomi, she's converted to Judaism. All those are good possibilities. But another reading that I've kind of come across recently is that she recognises she will starve unless Naomi takes her into the land, her own land. So in a way, I mean, it's not really human trafficking because Ruth, to a certain extent, is kind of going along with it.
It's almost like a reversal, isn't it? Because Ruth is putting Naomi into that role.
Well, I don't know. I suppose what we need to recognise here is if Ruth has no other recourse, she's in a very vulnerable position. So even if she's asking Naomi, Naomi is the one who can enable her to survive. So she's saying, I'll do anything, but just help me get bread, basically. And again, we might want to think about how common we read those other stories about people who are desperate and vulnerable, placing themselves under the care of others. Yeah. Yes, a question there, and then there was a question floating at the back too.
You were talking about the possible carnivalesque interpretation, and I think you said that comes out from the language and that we can't really do justice to some of the connotations of the Hebrew. Are you effectively saying that in some way our translations are a little bit inadequate? Or is it that the Bible doesn't, because it's the Bible, we don't want to bring those connotations to the
Well, I think even in the English language translations, so the NRSV is the translation I'd always recommend as the most accurate. Even in the English translations, you can see that this is a story which has comic elements, upside down. You know, Ruth basically propositions Boaz. That's not how things are supposed to be. It's supposed to be the man asking the woman. You know, people who are the house of Bethlehem is supposed to have bread, and yet there's famine. So there's lots of signs within the text that we can pick up ourselves, that this is an upside-down, topsy-turvy story. The very fact that things happen during the festival, barley festival, the harvest festival, is also a sign that this is a time of celebration, which is carnivalesque. The point about the Hebrew is that what we might not pick up on is the style that Boaz talks in. So Boaz is Hebrew. Not only does he talk for much longer than anyone else, but the style of Hebrew is more archaic, stilted, ponderous. And we pick up a little bit of that, but we don't necessarily get the full flavour of that. So he's set up as someone who's talking from a kind of almost an other era. Okay. Lots of questions here. I think you had your hand up sooner.
You referenced both rabbinic scholars and contemporary theologians, both of whom you could accuse of reading into the gaps. So you talked about what had happened to Boaz before Ruth arrived, and you talked about the way that interpretations are now put on it by people of different gender and sexuality. What difference does it make whether you read this as a Jewish text or a Christian text?
Okay. There's lots of questions in there I want to kind of explore a little bit. Yes. So one of the things I would say is there is no neutral, plain reading of the text. We cannot do that. So all that's happening is we're now more able to hear of people reading from a variety of contexts and identities. But the scholars who for years and years and years were men, and were men who were probably clerics or professional religious scholars in some way, probably celibate, their reading of the text is no more pure or unfiltered by their own experience than the reading of anyone else. I mean, it's just that wasn't acknowledged. So, I mean, if you want to test this out, read John Wesley's commentaries and you'll see how much he's bringing his own self into them, because we all do that. There's a quote that says commentaries are really autobiographies, and I think that's very true. Now, what was your question? Your question about whether it was Jewish or Christian text?
How we read.
Yes. That's a difficult one for me to answer because I love the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, and that's where I go primarily in my preaching, in my teaching. I'm very conscious that this is first and foremost a Jewish text and we need to honour it. So I don't want to make it secondary to the New Testament, but it is also part of our Christian canon. So I think it does make a difference. I think the difference for me would be that as a Christian, I want to see how the Book of Ruth and the story of Ruth is used by New Testament scholars and informs them. But I would certainly never want to close down Ruth to being only pointing towards Jesus. I think that's a very sorrowful reading if we just close it down to one way of reading it. Is that okay?
Yeah, I mean, if it wasn't part of the genealogy, would we actually even look at it as Christians?
Well, we look at many texts within the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible that are not referenced within the Gospels directly or indirectly. The Jewish scholar Alan Cooper, who was at the Jewish Seminary in New York, has written a really interesting piece in the Global Bible Commentary about the importance of Christians reading Leviticus and how the texts that we think, they're just kind of not relevant to us, are the texts that we need to engage with and do so on their own terms, rather than try and make everything fit into how we might have been taught to read the Bible. Okay, so Gail, you had your hand up, didn't you? No? Oh, is it somebody behind you? Yes, thank you.
I was just saying, but despite all the humans and the activity, the trickery, the mockery, the carnivalesque, what hope are we giving to our congregations? And despite the people that we're talking about, God fulfilled his promises, surely we can give them that hope.
I would say it's not despite, it's in and through. Our lives are messy. Our lives are a mixture of carnival, upside downness, violence, sorrow, grief, joy, connections, brokenness. That's part of our life. And God, I believe, works in and through all of that mess and confusion. I would also say that it's difficult to read Ruth as a story where God is doing all the heavy lifting. Ruth tells a story about people who live out their faith in a way that is continually referencing God, but seeking to bring about God's blessings on each other. Okay. All right. Let's have one more and then we'll probably break for lunch. Yes.
Do the Jewish community particularly read Ruth at a certain time, like harvest?
Yes, they do. Yes, it's Shavuot, which is the harvest festival, which is also associated with the giving of the Torah. So that's why Ruth particularly is associated with Torah. And there's a lovely reading from one of the rabbinical sources saying that Ruth is paired with the Torah because only if you are poor or in solidarity with those who struggle can you truly understand God's law and God's love, because it's a kind of sense that you have to be working from a position of struggling against injustice and struggling against oppression in order to properly encounter God's love and God's law. Goodness me, what a lot we've drawn out, and thank you for all your questions and comments and puzzled looks when you're thinking, my goodness, what's she talking about? I hope that's given you some food for thought going forward, and thank you very much.